The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to pick up the conversation that we started earlier in the week on our China Global South show about the debt issues. And again, this is one of those topics that we just have to keep coming back to, in part because it touches so many different aspects, not only of the China-Africa relationship, but of what's going on today in many African societies, because the politics of debt are touching every aspect of the economy. And debt servicing, we talked about earlier this week, that is a huge issue in Kenya and in Nigeria, where a majority of the government's revenues are being used to service these debts. And we've just had the major breakthrough in Zambia, and there's lots of excitement about that. So if you haven't heard that episode, I encourage you to take a listen to our discussion with Matt Minji from Rhodium Group that we did earlier this week. It was a fantastic deep dive into what's going on in Zambia. Today, though, we're going to focus on the question of debt in Nigeria, specifically the Chinese debt. Now, Cobus, this is one of those topics that you and I have been talking about, I think, earlier than almost any of the other topics on debt in Africa. It emerged in Nigeria well before the pandemic that Nigeria was going to be subject to debt trap diplomacy, predatory lending, that China was going to come in and seize Nigerian assets. The Nigerian media and Nigerian politics made it such that, these concerns about the debt were so much more pronounced there than they were almost anywhere else in Africa. One of the interesting things, though, is that when you look at what I call the jet stream of narratives, you know how a jet stream is, where it's these flows of wind and weather that kind of circulate around the globe. Well, a lot of the narratives do come out of Nigeria and spread through the rest of Anglophone Africa. So just as we've talked about that, the debt trap narrative originated in India, was amplified in the United States, but certainly Nigeria also played a role in that because it was picked up in other Anglophone African countries. You have a theory, though, Cobus, in terms of the governance question about the role of Chinese debt in Nigeria as to why it plays particularly well there.
Yes, we've been puzzled for a long time about why the Nigerian press periodically freaks out about Chinese debt when the Chinese debt makes up such a small portion of Nigeria's total debt. I think it's about 4% at the moment, and the Nigerian debt management officers had to debunk a lot of debt trap stories over the years. A lot of this asset is going to be seized, that asset is going to be seized, and so on. And, this is happening against the background of ballooning debt of other kinds in Nigeria. So there's a lot of commercial debt, a lot of debt to Western bondholders and other kind of private lenders, but actually not that much debt to China. But the China debt plays a very large role discursively in the discussion in the country. And it seemed to me that a lot of it probably has to do with political factors around trying to paint different incumbent politicians as being too close to China and essentially selling the country out to the Chinese, which, obviously has a lot more to do with a kind of historical trauma of colonialism, but also, hooking into Anglophone discourse coming out of the US and India and Europe around Chinese predatory lending. So in that sense, I think it has a lot more to do with politics in Nigeria rather than actual debt concerns or Chinese debt concerns rather, and a larger kind of creeping anxiety about debt more generally in Nigeria is my take on it anyway.
Okay, that does make a lot of sense. And that does play out not only in Nigeria, but in other countries as well, where China becomes a domestic political issue. We oftentimes see this flare around elections. So that's not surprising, given your insights there. Let's just kind of do a benchmark here. According to the Nigerian Debt Management Office, again, one of the most credible debt management offices on the continent, in terms of their transparency and the way that they disseminate information and the clarity with which they do it. I've really personally believed that the DMO is an example for other African governments, and not just African governments, all governments, in how they should communicate what they are doing in terms of their borrowing. So, according to the DMO, in December 2022, that's the last numbers that we have about Chinese debt, the total amounts to $4.29 billion. Now, that sounds like a lot, but as Cobus said, it's about 4% of the total. Nigeria's total debt now is around $100 billion. So again, when you put it in that context, you start to see how ridiculous the sentiments are in terms of China somehow is going to take over Nigeria. China is going to somehow use its debts to exert massive amounts of political influence. It's got 4% of the total. And unlike other forms of debt, either domestic borrowing or Eurobond borrowing, okay, this is very important. The Chinese loans are tied to 15 specific infrastructure projects, whereas the other borrowing that the Nigerian government has done, it just goes into the coffers and it doesn't have that accountability tied to it in terms of a specific project. That also differentiates Chinese lending from, say, private creditor lending as well as domestic lending in terms of the approach on that. So we want to get this down first before our conversation today, but I also want to bring up this question, Cobus, of governance. It's a theme that is coming up a little bit more and more now. So we talked a couple weeks ago about the situation in Kenya with the standard gauge railway, and we quoted a fascinating new documentary series by The Elephant and Africa Uncensored, which revealed that there was a lot of corruption in Kenyan borrowing. In Zambia, President Hichilema has said that his predecessor, Edgar Lungu, borrowed irresponsibly. And what you're going to hear today in Nigeria is that the early Buhari administration, they borrowed irresponsibly as well. And this is a question that the West and even Africans themselves don't always like to bring up in the discourse about borrowing. Easier to point your fingers at the Chinese and even the Eurobond rather than to point to mismanagement and corruption by local leaders.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that then kind of breaks down along political lines within the country. But I agree that it's much easier to blame China for everything than it is to blame global South governments for some of these lapses. In part because frequently the global South governments have very few options and they're constrained in lots of directions. But there's a few things. One, obviously, is corruption, is a big problem. Another one is lack of capacity that we've been highlighting a lot, and frequently lack of kind of human resources in terms of like one needs those lawyers that, the kind of really kind of shark lawyers that had worked in these issues in other capitals before and then kind of getting them to an African capital to then work for the government is sometimes a tall order. But then also, I think a lot of it also actually comes down to issues around electoral cycles and democracy, actually. Because, obviously we've seen in the past that African governments frequently like to work with China because they are able to get projects done before elections. And it's possible to kind of force or push those firms to deliver some projects, according to a political calendar. So there's pressure on them to show that they are building projects. And those projects ideally would need to have been done before the next elections. But there's also, I think, that a kind of a short-termism that kind of creeps in there too, which one sees in Western democracies too, where they only need to survive until the next election, or they only need to win the next election, and there isn't an election after that. So, like if one looks at a situation like Sri Lanka, there was a lot of lending there that happened because it was politically expedient, but then when all of that kind of went to hell, that ended up kind of being left to the next government. I think there's a similar kind of tendency in a place like Kenya, for example. And I think the way that the electoral cycle factors into these decisions, I think, is something that's difficult to unpack because, of course, everyone wants democracy. But then how the democracy actually functions in relation to these longer-term economic planning issues is a challenge everywhere. It's also a challenge in Western democracies, I think.
And of course, one of the criticisms, a long-standing criticism of the Chinese in their early BRI phase was that when they came into a country like Nigeria or Kenya that was dealing with a lot of the issues you're talking about in terms of weak governance or politicized governance, they didn't do sufficient due diligence. So they just kind of fed loans into countries that either didn't have the carrying capacity to sustain those debts or like in Sri Lanka or in the case of Nigeria in some of the projects there, they weren't feasible. And there was not going to be an ROI on this. There wasn't going to be a repayment, or it just didn't make sense. So, for example, when Muhammadu Buhari puts the railway university that the Chinese are building in his hometown, again, he's making that decision for strictly political reasons, not necessarily in the best interest of the country. That's where the Chinese come under criticism for facilitating that type of development finance. And I think there's some data that's been done, some research about where Chinese development finance goes. And oftentimes it's in the general vicinity of the leaders, the president or prime minister's hometowns and home provinces. That's not the healthiest thing either. So the Chinese are not entirely free of accountability here when it comes to the governance question. But let's now focus on Nigeria specifically. And I had the wonderful opportunity to speak with one of the leading experts in this field, Dr. Zuhumnan Dapel, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group at the Center for Energy Ethics at the University of St. Andrews. He is a regular commentator on Nigerian economics. He's regularly on Nigerian media, and he's an expert in the field of debt finance and also the economics and politics of debt. And it was really great to have him explain the dynamics of what's going on in Nigeria. Let's take a listen to our discussion with Dr. Dapel. Dr. Zuhumnan Dapel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's really wonderful to have you on the show.
Pleased to be with you, Eric. Thank you.
It's really a fitting time for us to speak with you. There's a lot of attention now about the debt crisis in Africa, especially after the Zambian government restructured its debt together with China and the Paris Club creditors. Now a lot of attention is shifting to other countries in Africa. Nigeria is one of them. Now, Nigeria will not come under the G20's common framework because it's at a different stage of development than, say, Zambia is, but there's still a lot of questions about the debt situation. So you've mentioned in some of your previous discussions about how in the decade from 2012 to 2022, Nigeria's debt ballooned by more than 400%. And according to the Debt Management Office, the total public debt now stands at about $103 billion, with a sizable portion of that owed to foreign creditors, including China. Maybe we can start our discussion today looking at the current debt situation in Nigeria and give us a little bit of background of how we got here today.
Okay, thanks for asking that question. Looking at Nigeria's debt situation, within roughly half a century, Nigeria's debt rose from less than $1 billion to over $70 billion. That's from roughly 1970s to as of 2021. Now, let me try to clarify here that much of the focus of this discussion will be about Nigeria's external debt, because Nigeria's external debt is foreignly adjudicated, and there are limited powers the country has in terms of changing the regulations governing that debt. Only America has the privilege of printing its way out of domestic and foreign debt, but countries that don't print the US dollar would have to raise foreign currency to pay for their debt. So much of the focus I'm going to be talking about Nigeria's external debt. So it rose from less than $1 billion to over $70 billion within half a century. And in my view, there were two main factors at the root of the rise of Nigeria's debt. The first is the rate at which the country borrows. So according to the World Bank's international debt statistics, for the past 50 years, Nigeria was on average drawing at the speed of more than $2 billion a year from its loan commitments. So when a country secures a loan, the entire loan is not disbursed to the country. It has to be drawing out of that gradually. So Nigeria was drawing out roughly $2 billion on average. However, the significant rise in the debt stock is attributed to external loans within the last decade. So in the lead up to the 2015 general elections, about $9 billion, 5 times the average initial withdrawals was pinched in 2014. Similarly, in the 2 years leading up to the 2019 presidential elections, that's in 2017 and 18, close to $25 billion was withdrawn. This pattern could be linked to the incidence of voracity effect. So it's a notion that the absence of strong political and legal institutions combined with the presence of multiple powerful groups forces the mismanagement of public finance, possibly to finance political campaign in attempts to reinforce or tighten their grip on power. As both presidents during the lead up to these elections in the case of Nigeria were incumbents seeking re-elections before the massive debt accumulations. So that's the first reason.
So can I just stop you there, just so I understand what you're saying there? So a lot of this borrowing you're suggesting was not done to build infrastructure or to finance health and welfare programs. They borrowed on the foreign markets, the international markets, in order to finance their own political campaigns and to use it for, say, non-development purposes.
The way the situation presented itself would leave one with no reason to think like that. So if we look at the periods that these withdrawals were made, we're supposed to see the external sector in terms of the balance sheet looking a bit different. We're expected to see, okay, maybe they're using part of this to service other loans. We're expected to see maybe they're using part of this to defend the currency, to shield the currency from disruptions from the world oil market. But that's not really happening. But the part of the loan that we could say is tied to infrastructure development is that came from China, which is less than 10% of the total debt stock.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even less than 10%, it's less than 5%, because according to the DMO's numbers here, I'm seeing that there are $4.29 billion of Chinese loans as of last December, but that is a small fraction of what you're saying the total borrowing is. And so it's really quite disconcerting in some respects that so much borrowing was happening but not being used for productive purposes.
Yeah, one could infer like that, but politicians would always want to hear you say what pleases them. They have less regard to facts that don't align with their feelings, their ideologies. They just want something to make them in a good light. But that's not how it works. Yeah, so I was trying to give you the second reason behind Nigeria's expanding debt stock, the external debt stock, has been the management strategy, how the debt was managed in the past, how it was serviced by various regimes.
I guess what I don't understand, and I've been following the debt issue now in Nigeria for at least 10 years, is I see so much hysteria, and really hysteria is the right word for it, in the legislature, in the House of Representatives, about the dangers of Chinese lending. And there's been investigations about the debt trap and allegations that China is going to take over parts of Nigeria and seize assets and all of this. When in fact, what you're telling me is that of the total debt, only about $4 billion is owed to China. The Chinese loans are tied to infrastructure, specifically 15 different infrastructure projects. And when you compare this against what you are saying about the patterns of lending over the 10 years from 2012 to 2022, it seemed by many standards quite reckless. So why would legislators in the House of Representatives and in the media as well focus so much attention on China when it looks like Chinese lending was actually more responsible than other borrowing done by the government, and not on this binge of lending done by the various administrations outside of those Chinese loans? Why is it that the Chinese loans seem to attract so much attention?
So, I wouldn't say every politician, but majority politics is a dirty game, and people try to weaponize incomplete information, incorrect information. I think what is required on the side of government is transparency with the citizens. If they should have an avenue where they lay out facts and explain things to people, they should have spokespersons that are trusted. Now, the government has to earn trust for its message to be believed. How is the government earning trust? If you say next year and you stick to these things, you are consistent with telling the truth, in the future, nobody would doubt what you're saying. So when it's in the season of politics, the oppositions would look for whatever means to discredit the government in power, and one of which is the Chinese loan at the time. but it's up to the government to come out and lay bare the facts. So like the information I discussed with you about the Chinese loan tied to infrastructure project was a public information on the Debt Management Office website, assuming that that information is the truth and so on and so forth. So if there are cries by citizens that Nigeria's asset it's being mortgaged in the future, the government should come out and say, these are the terms and conditions of the contract. And from what I saw on the Debt Management Office website, they say these loans are for maturity period of roughly 30 years, and the interest rate is roughly 2%. So which country would not go for such loans that they're meant to build infrastructure? And by the way...
That's a good deal. That was a good deal. I mean, those are low-cost loans.
Yeah, that's a good deal. So we have massive infrastructure gap to close, ranging from power, that's electricity, telecommunication, water, and so on and so forth. And one of the preconditions to pull in foreign direct investment is that your infrastructure should be strong. And not only will that help in pulling in foreign direct investment, it will keep the investment within and it will lower the average cost of doing business. So that is very good and people should stick with it. But the government has to be transparent to the people and say, these are the terms and conditions of the loan. And we are not hiding anything in the dark.
So taking all of that into account, what you said in terms of some of the loan mismanagement, but also the need for transparency, and then also this question of how is Nigeria going to fund its infrastructure, let's take into account the fact that the Chinese were tasked to provide loans of upwards of $14 billion for two railways, for example, the Eastern Line and the Coastal Line railways. They've backed away from that. The previous government under Muhammadu Buhari held out hope that the China Exim Bank was going to come through with these loans. They did not. Then there was the AKK pipeline, which was $1 billion joint venture with the Nigerian government as well. The Chinese have backed away from that. So the Chinese don't want to get involved in large-scale infrastructure in Nigeria anymore because, in part, they're not doing that elsewhere in Africa, but also you've pointed out that the management of the economy leaves, I think, a lot of skepticism in the minds of international financiers. So I'm wondering, how is Nigeria going to finance the infrastructure that it needs to attract the investment that you say it needs if it's not going to come from the Chinese, if the private capital from banks like Standard Chartered is too expensive, the Eurobonds, they're too demanding because they want repayment in 5 years, 10 years, not 30 or 40 years, and the interest rates are higher. Where does the money come from to build the infrastructure that Nigeria needs?
Well, that's a big question. As I address this question, let me just say a few things about Chinese pulling out of financing Nigeria's infrastructure projects through loans. So in roughly 3 years ago, I got an article out with just an op-ed, I would say, in one of the Nigerian national dailies. I titled it by 2023. I titled the article, I said, the Nigerian economy to rise from the ashes by 2030. So I had a call to one Professor Ishmael Oboru. So what we explain here, we were basing the reason for Nigeria's future economic success on these infrastructure projects that China was trying to finance, the AKK projects. So, and the railways, because Nigeria's two commercial capitals, one in the north, which has comparative advantage in food production, which is Kano. Then the second is Lagos, which has advantage in financial services, but not comparative advantage in food production. So linking these two commercial cities with the rail line would lower the average cost of food. So I'm trying to get into detail for us to understand the magnitude of the big minus that the pulling out of these infrastructure is to finance Nigeria's economic progress. So the food prices are driving almost 75% of Nigeria's inflation, and that is attributed to cost of transportation between the north and the south. So this rail project is supposed to close this food price gap. Now, if it's not coming into fruition, that would negatively impact. And in the past, 3 academics, one from Harvard, one from MIT, and one from Dalhousie University, but I know one of the authors, Dozie, they did a research about the impact of the colonial railroads in Nigeria and trying to find out whether the impact still persists. So rail stopped working in the 80s, but their positive impacts were persisting up till today. So imagine when you have the rail system back, what benefit you'll be getting, it will be more than times the one you're getting. And the moment the railway stops, it coincides with when the gap in poverty between the North and South started to open. So one can infer that the North was benefiting substantially from the existence of the railroads. So it's a big minus. So first of all, if done, such public investment in infrastructure can help boost more inclusive growth and create more economic opportunities. So the return on infrastructure investment cannot be overemphasized. It can, according to estimate, each $100 billion in public infrastructure spending could generate roughly 1 million jobs, and each $100 spent on infrastructure raises private sector output by an average of $17 in the long run. So the railroad, which includes the 12 billion coastal railway connecting cities in the oil-producing regions, would create up to 200,000 local jobs during construction and about 30,000 permanent posts once the line becomes operational. So these are some of the benefits that the ending of this project is going to cause to elude Nigerians. So I don't want to bombard with lots of information here, but how is government going to finance this?
That's the key question. Where does the money come from?
Yeah, so if China is backing out, which is one of the major bilateral lenders, the next direction is to focus on the multilateral institutions, primarily the World Bank, the IMF, and the Africa Development Bank. But they have a lot on their table dealing with because many countries...
But they've made it clear that they don't want to spend on railways. They want to spend on green energy and data centers, and they're not as interested in the large-scale infrastructure that China used to finance. So that's the bigger problem in that.
So that's pretty much a big constraint for that to happen. There may be other countries Nigeria want to look at. I don't know which one come on top of my head straight away. But
I don't think you're alone in struggling to figure this out. I think a lot of people are struggling to figure this out.
You know, it's foreign resources that you need to build these infrastructures. If it were domestic capital, that's fine. Nigeria may have the human brains, but there's some infrastructure they have to be. I know that there were some attempts reaching out to Germany, Siemens, to help build Nigeria's power infrastructure. And by the way, it's massive. Closing Nigeria's energy gap is roughly $10 billion a year for over a decade to close Nigeria's electricity gap. So that's a huge amount, and that's partly affecting businesses in the country. So yeah, I don't know what efforts are going on the side of Germany, Siemens.
Well, there's another issue that I'd like to get your take on. So in March 2022, there was a terrible attack on the Abuja-Kaduna train, and a number of people were killed. Terrorists derailed it, and it was just an awful attack. And what ended up happening, this was a Chinese-built railway, and since then, people have been reluctant to go back onto the Abuja-Kaduna railway because they're concerned, rightly, for safety. And the irony was that the trains were supposed to be safer for people traveling in Nigeria, particularly in northern Nigeria, compared to taking the roads where bandits were on the roads. And so there was this sense of confidence that people had on the trains. And so the idea now that so many people are staying off that railway and even other railways because of fear of attack, it's making it difficult to repay the debt and the loans to the Chinese because the traffic volumes on the train are not anywhere near as high. How does security play into this question of infrastructure as well, given the fact that northern Nigeria in particular does face some very acute security challenges?
Yeah, it's really huge. It's really, really huge. One of it, you've mentioned how the insecurity affects the ability for that service to run for this thing. And financing military hardware diverts substantial part of our resources to fight insecurity. So the government resources is being consumed significantly in that direction. So the more you spend on fighting insecurity, the less you have for building other infrastructure. So that really, really affects the security of the country as well.
Okay, let's close our conversation again, looking forward, and very briefly, just let me know and give me a sense of what your forecast is. Again, we've talked about how the Chinese are probably going to stay on the sidelines for the large-scale infrastructure. Nigeria faces some very severe security challenges, acute shortages of energy, distribution problems domestically within the country in terms of logistics. So what's your forecast in the next, say, 1 to 2 years in terms of where Nigeria is going?
It would be difficult to make forecasts because the current electoral victory is on trial. It's hotly contested in court. So let's work with two scenarios. One scenario is the sitting president would win the case in court and stay in power up to the next 2 years. If he is in power and that this is where he started, he's taking off subsidy, the value of the currency is significantly falling, and these things are badly hitting Nigerians. They are not going to give him good approval rating at all. And if he wants to override this, 1.5 years is too short a time for him to do that. So in the next 2 years, we're just going to see that. So that's one. Then the second scenario, let's assume the victory is upturned in court and the new guy shows up. So there are two main contenders on the ballot, apart from Tinubu. One is the PDP guy, Atiku Abubakar, and another is Mr. Peter Obi, who is very vibrant among the youths, who is known to have shifted Nigeria's political discourse. So if he comes into power, he's got different approach for governance, cutting waste. He's more like, he's a business guy, but he connects with low-level people. So he's going to reverse some of these things that Tinubu is doing and bring about much more relief for vast majority of the population. Atiku Abubakar, he's kind of like a business guy, capitalist guy, let's run things effective. He has a touch of working with very, very bright and talented people that would bring about some positive change. The central bank, the fiscal side of things, ministerial position. So these are the scenarios that I can point out in the next 2 years. But it's going to be difficult to predict unless you use two scenarios.
It's going to be difficult. Okay, so Dr. Zuhumnan Dapel is a non-resident senior fellow at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group at the Center for Energy Ethics at the University of St. Andrews. Dr. Dapel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Wonderful to connect with you and to hear your fascinating insights on the Nigerian economy.
Thank you very much, Eric.
It's absolutely fascinating to talk to Dr. Dapel. I wish you were there to have joined us for the conversation. We're going to keep this conversation going. I think the next place that I want to talk about is Ethiopia and then Ghana. We're going to give it a break for a while, though, because I think we've gone too deep on debt for the past few weeks. But we will come back to this. We just have to, though, because debt shapes the politics in so many ways, as we saw in Nairobi, with days of deadly riots that broke out in the streets of the capital, in part because the administration of President William Ruto had to increase taxes and end some of the subsidies in order to pay for some of the debts. So this is an absolutely fundamental issue. China, of course, is changing so quickly in how they are lending money. And again, I'm not entirely sure there's a full understanding of the changes that have taken place in terms of the Chinese lending approach among many African stakeholders. So I hope that we'll be able to shed some light on that in the coming weeks. So the combination of all that makes debt one of the key issues going forward for us in terms of topics that we're going to have to stay with.
Absolutely, because the thing is, debt is similar to my other obsession, like depressing obsession, which is climate, which is kind of that both debt and climate. Why they're so important is not only that they are massive problems on their own, which they are, but also because they translate into a whole bunch of other problems. Kind of including conflict, including like civil protests, including general kind of social instability. So yep, we're gonna have to keep talking about debt, sadly.
Okay, well, I am so glad you brought up the question of climate, because we've had two fascinating articles on the site in the past few weeks, one by you and another by a columnist in Indonesia, who both effectively said the same thing. There's this thing out there called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP. And the idea was, correct me if I'm wrong, you know this world better than I do, but the idea was that the wealthy, enlightened states in the global north are going to give billions of dollars of financing to the developing countries who are low income in the global south, and they're going to help them transition from fossil fuels and carbon-based energy to clean energy. It always seems a little bit odd to me because take Africa, but Asia is probably the same as well. And Asia, excluding India and China, of course, but Southeast Asia, a country like Indonesia, are not the major contributors to emissions. They're not the problem. But anyway, we're talking about this thing called the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So billions of dollars went to, or at least were pledged to South Africa. I think 8.5 billion was the total.
Yes.
And it turns out, when we start looking at the fine print, that these wealthy countries, remember, who caused this problem in the first place, are not providing financing in the form of grants, but they're extending loans to these countries, Indonesia and South Africa. The vast majority of the $8.5 billion to do the just energy transition is in the form of concessional loans, which albeit means that they're low cost, 2-3% interest rates, far below the current. That's affordable, but it adds to the country's debt burdens. And that doesn't feel very just to me.
Yeah, anyone who, as I am at the moment, as part of a bunch of different research projects, anyone who does a deep dive into this has to get ready to be more cynical when they come out on the other side. Because, all of this is couched in terms of just transitions, in terms of, saving ourselves from a mounting climate crisis. But as you say, the debt burden is significant. So it breaks down differently for different countries. But in the case of South Africa, only 4% of the amount pledged is in the form of grant. Now, as you say, the G7...
That is crazy. I mean, that is crazy.
I think concessional lending is about 60%, and then the rest is commercial lending. A big chunk of this money will actually be in the form of commercial, high-interest rated lending, not only concessional lending.
See, but this is what infuriates me, is because here they are screwing the Global South not once with the climate, which they caused, okay, but twice now on the debt that they're actually profiting from the just transition. And the fact that they have the audacity to call it just, okay, as if it's some kind of justice and it's a moral righteousness attached to it, is even more obscene. And yet they're profiting from it.
Yeah, it gets even worse. Again, get ready to be cynical. So they're trying to impose this kind of model of decarbonization on the Global South, while at the same time giving themselves all kinds of breaks. So what we've seen over the last while is that even though Europe and the US, Europe particularly, I think is in this case, has kind of positioned themselves as these kind of norm setters on these issues, since the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, Europe has essentially leaned hard back into hydrocarbons. And what we're seeing in places like the UK is that there's still so much government subsidies of the oil and gas industry in the UK that to a certain extent, that plus kind of undermining of things like carbon credit systems by kind of putting out all these kind of free permits, that the UK government is actively undermining their own climate kind of goals. And in the process now officially not officially, but they're starting to cool down a whole bunch of climate goals that they set themselves. So it really is problematic. So I was drawing a lot on, as you mentioned, the Indonesian climate writer Firdaus Kayadi wrote for us on this. I was drawing a lot on his input, and one of the points that he was making, and this is the kind of interesting kind of political fallout from all of this, is that this debt trap language that we've been criticizing for years, as applied by Western stakeholders frequently to Chinese lending in the Global South, that language is now starting to be directed back at the G7 from the Global South. So we're seeing all of these NGOs in Indonesia starting to talk about how Europe and the US is trying to trap Indonesia in a debt trap through this kind of just transition funding, which is a very interesting kind of turn.
Yeah. China is not immune from this as well. So interestingly, China relies a lot on hydroelectric, but because of low water levels in many of their river systems, they've had to increase the output of coal. 21 gigabytes of new coal-fired power plants have come online this year alone. China's coal-powered energy output increased by 14% in June. And so just as you're seeing in Europe, when the politics and the realities of providing power to your people come under pressure, coal is a big standby and is very important still in these countries. So the idea, again, that they are then preaching to Global South countries that they shouldn't use coal or they shouldn't use carbon-based energy, everybody understands we need to get away from this. But the fact that they're using loans to communicate this, and at the same time, they're not doing it as much themselves, is kind of ridiculous. To be fair to the Chinese, though, they have installed about 3.5 times as much solar power capacity and 2.5 times as much wind power capacity as the US. The US is making some progress, but let's not forget that one of the two major political parties in the US is still struggling to grapple with the reality of climate change, does not even accept it as a fact, even though It's starting to a little bit, given the fact that much of the United States these days is literally just burning up. You can't believe the temperatures, Cobus, in Arizona and parts of Texas these past few weeks. So maybe that will bring the Republican Party some religion on climate, although I am a little bit skeptical. New polling data came out this week, though, in the race between Biden and Trump, and it's relevant for this discussion, that puts them more or less neck and neck. And so if we see a Trump presidency again in 2024, which is a possibility, we can't simply discount it, one has to wonder what happens to the global climate agenda.
And the thing is, again, just to add more kind of gloom to the conversation, I think to a certain extent the idea that, let me put it in a nuanced way, I think the idea that climate concern is only a democratic kind of like concern, I think is to a certain extent overstated, because despite the fact the Democrats are much better on these issues than the Republicans are, or not as actively destructive on it as the Republicans are, it still is. The Guardian reported last year that up to 2022, the amount of US government money that flowed into Africa for hydrocarbon-related projects was around $9 billion, whereas the amount that flowed in for renewables was around $600 million.
Yeah, you see these charts, which have a little tiny bit for solar and green renewable, and then most of it is still hydrocarbon. Exactly what you're saying.
Meanwhile, new research that came out of Fudan University this week, which we hope to interview them about soon, showed that now 40+% of Chinese power provision along the Belt and Road is solar and wind, with an additional 14% being hydro. So in that sense, like just in terms of the numbers, China's doing much, much better. Hopefully that will kind of light a fire, like under the West to try and be better. But what we've seen so far is that it's mostly seems to be about trying to benefit their own financial industries rather than any actual real kind of grappling with the issue.
And you don't see anyone I don't know if it's the global north, I don't know if it's the advanced economies, the G7 states, however you want to frame it. But you don't see people making real substantive sacrifices to their lifestyle for the climate. Okay?
But I have to say that, yeah, definitely I see that. But the thing is, even that kind of personal responsibility narrative, that itself is a false narrative.
No. I'm actually talking on the policy level. I'm talking about government policy to make real changes in society, either to push back and increase taxes on oil suppliers, not on the individual. That, you're right. That is propaganda from the oil industry, that it's up to us as people to recycle our tin. No. I'm talking about societies making sacrifices in the name of the climate. And even in the Just Energy Transition Partnership, they're not even making a sacrifice in terms of grants.
But the thing is, it's not even an issue of sacrifice. Like, there's a lot of money to be made here. There's a ton of money to be made for the kind of renewable industries. Yeah, but like, if it's possible, but the thing is, the entire economy in the global north and in the global south has to be transitioned onto renewables. That includes not only power lines, it includes a ton of all kinds of small scale installation and retrofitting and so on. There is a lot of jobs that could be created for poor people from this being poor people in the US and Europe and poor people in the rest of the world. There's a ton of good that can be done by actually achieving this transition. Like for a lot of these countries, it could be a complete game changer economically. But at the moment, one just sees that these governments are just so beholden to oil lobbies. They're obviously were so well funded by oil lobbies. All of this is being framed as you say, in terms of sacrifice. Whereas sacrifice is the wrong framing for this. Like, this is a massive, massive economic opportunity that everyone is ignoring because they're being so well funded by the oil industry.
But I mean sacrifice in the sense that you're going to have to make some concessions. So maybe sacrifice is not the right word, but concessions or compromises that we've not been asked at any part of our lifestyle in the United States to concede anything in terms of our convenience and our comfort, as wasteful as that is. And even in the EV sector, you look at the Ford F-150 Lightning truck. This thing is enormous, okay? And when you see the amount of cobalt and nickel and all of these battery metals that we cover so closely in our other aspects, and we know the environmental impact that those are having. The fact is that these trucks are not actually that green at the end of the day. But people want their power, they want their size, they want all of the features and conveniences that they had with the F-150 as an internal combustion engine. And that's where, again, I come back to that we're not being asked to make any concession in our lifestyle for this, even though our lifestyle is based on an economic model of growth that is simply not economically and climate-wise sustainable in the long run. That's the frustration I have. I mean, I don't know what we do about it, but...
Yeah, I share that frustration. But the thing is, there's so much that can be done without even making people choose a smaller car, right? Kind of like so much of this has to do with how the power grid works and just doing the work of integrating renewables into existing power grids, for example. And a lot of that has very little kind of political capital for politicians, but there are huge stakes, huge kind of vested interest in them on the corporate level. And that's where a lot of things are being blocked. And again, it's lobbying. A lot of it is simply oil and gas company lobbying, to try and kind of hold these things back just a few more years so they can just squeeze a little bit more profit out of it. And what we've seen, kind of like following the Ukraine crisis, a lot of these companies, oil companies have made record profits over the last 2 years, like massive profits, to the extent that they're now so flush with cash that they don't feel the need to even like deliver the kind of the extremely modest little kind of green goals that they set for themselves. Even those are kind of falling by the wayside because from their perspective, the oil kind of game is booming. And the oil game is booming because politicians are enabling it to boom. That's where we are.
Okay, I need to apologize to everybody. We did not plan on having an entirely second show all about climate tacked onto our show about Nigerian debt. Cobus and I, by the way, we've been doing this now for 14 years. And we do this multiple times a week where we just get onto a phone conversation and like 45 minutes goes by. This is what our phone conversations sound like all the time.
Yeah, it's also like a cautionary tale about like immersing yourself in climate issues, because I'm like the ancient mariner about climate now. Like I'm just like preaching to everyone that flees from me.
No, you're like, the Don't Look Up movie on Netflix where, you're the Leonardo DiCaprio character of like, it's coming, it's here. So we apologize for going much longer than we anticipated, but this topic of climate and debt together is absolutely fascinating. If you're interested in what Cobus wrote and also from our Indonesian contributors and all of our climate coverage, we've got some great material now over on the website. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. A lot of it is open without access to the paywall. So we also have a China-Africa climate section right on the homepage that our fantastic climate editor, Njenga Ekena, he is writing every week some new columns and new stories about what the Chinese are doing in Africa. We're working on a new interactive map to highlight all of the green energy projects that the Chinese are doing across Africa, to point out, again, what Cobus was talking about, that in this new iteration of the BRI, the Chinese in many ways are going green, whereas the US and Europe are talking about it in their initiatives, but the Chinese are actually doing it, and we're going to be mapping it out. We also have this fantastic, brand new, first ever interactive map of the entire cobalt supply chain in the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you are interested in the EV supply chain, critical minerals, you're going to want to see this. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/cobalt. That too is open to everybody. No membership or subscription required there. If you would like to get the daily brief and all of the great stuff that the team is doing, that does require a subscription. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You will not regret it. People who get this say they love it. We're so proud of the work that everybody's doing in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East to put this newsletter together every day. And again, you can try it free for 30 days. See if you like it. If you don't like it, you can cancel anytime. We won't charge you for it. And if you are a student and a teacher, well, just send me an email, eric@chinaafricaproject.com, and I will be happy to send you a 50% off discount link. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.